Good morning, everyone. It is February 4th here in East Central Alabama, and today I'm going to be getting my seed potatoes in the ground. Now, last year I planted my seed potatoes on February the 14th, so about 10 days later than what I'm doing this year. My goal was to actually get the potatoes in the ground 2 weeks earlier than what I did last year, in hopes that I'd have a little bit bigger tuber at harvest time. Unfortunately, it's just been super wet this past week, and there was no way that I could get the potatoes into the beds. The beds were just soaking wet. So you don't want to plant your potatoes when it's really, really wet in the ground. It can increase their chance of rotting before they sprout, increases the risk of disease, and also the ground gets really compacted around it and makes it harder for tubers to develop. So let your ground dry out a little bit before you get your potatoes in the ground if you're having a really wet spring. Now, here in East Central Alabama, we have a very short window for growing potatoes. We grow the Irish potato types that can mature in about 90 to 110 days. We just can't produce long season potatoes due to the heat that starts getting up in late May and early June. We have to harvest at that point even if our tops still look really green and looks like that we should still be making tubers. The temperatures are just too high here for the potatoes to continue to increase in size. So a lot of people had commented on last year's video that I was harvesting my potatoes too early, but the main reason that we do that here is just because of the heat. It's just entirely too hot to leave your potatoes in the ground. So I'm going to link in this video to where I planted potatoes last year, where I harvested potatoes last year, and to the video from last week where I cut up my seed potatoes to let them seal off and harden off before we planted them. I always cut my potatoes up and leave a couple of good eyes on the piece that you're going to plant. You want to cut them up in advance and let them harden off. That reduces risk of disease or rotting. Now, my dad had commented on my last video saying that he's never let his potatoes seal off. He just cuts them up the day of, drops them in the ground, and doesn't have any trouble with it. So, you know, that's still a feasible option apparently, and he gets a good potato harvest every year. So let's get these potatoes in the ground. Now, these are Kennebecks. They'll produce a good frying potato. We do have some Irish cobbler potatoes and Yukon Golds. The Irish cobblers are a higher moisture content. They do better for mashing up as opposed to frying like the Kennebecks. What I did last year, I sprayed all of my potatoes or the little cut up pieces of potatoes with a biological fungicide. This is safe for organic gardening. It helps to reduce rot, reduce any kind of fungal disease, blight, things like that that can develop. So it inoculates the roots and helps to protect your plant throughout the season as it grows. So I've got that mixed up in my little sprayer. What I've done here with my soil, I've dug about 6-inch deep furrows that I'm going to put these potatoes into. Some people do 3 to 4 inches. I like 6 just because I don't have to hill my potatoes quite as much as they come along and grow throughout the season. Now, with your soil, potatoes really like loose, loamy soil. So this particular bed initially was built with composted cow manure, and it's been amended through the last couple of years with rabbit manure about twice a year. I use some good organic fertilizer just to kind of build the soil usually when I'm planting. Now, I don't go completely organic. I do use some commercial fertilizers as well for items that really need a higher content of nitrogen or something. But building your soil is really important so that you have a nice base to plant your potatoes in. Additionally, potatoes like a lot of potassium, so I usually put wood ash down on my beds at least once a year. Now, that does increase the alkalinity of the soil, but if you balance that with some peat moss, you get a good combination there, because potatoes do like their soil to be a little bit acidic, so you don't want, you know, a real high alkalinity from your wood ash without some sort of medium to balance that off. One other thing that you can do to keep your soil nice and fluffy is plant a crop like carrots in the season prior to growing potatoes. So this particular bed I did grow carrots in, and when I went through here with my hoe to get these furrows put in, I mean, the soil was already really nice and light and fluffy. So let's get these potatoes in. First thing I'm going to actually do is put down some organic fertilizer. And the reason I use organic fertilizer for this step is because it won't burn your plants. And you can put just a generous amount down in your furrows. It takes organic fertilizer a while to break down and really be available to the plant. The potatoes don't need a lot of fertilizer early on, but you'll have this in place so that when the potatoes do start needing nutrients, this has broken down to the point where it's available to your plants. So we're going to just get each piece sprayed. There's a nice eye on this potato that I can see. Make sure your eye points upward. So eye formation on the top of this one, we'll get it sprayed. And I usually plant my potatoes about 6 to 8 inches apart. I do tend to crowd them a little bit in the beds, probably more so than people that are planting in the ground, just because of a smaller space that I have to grow these. So the reason we're only doing about 3/4 of this bed in potatoes is due to the onions that I have growing in the end of this bed. If you saw some of my earlier videos, we lost a large portion of our onion crop to a really cold snap in December. We got down to 11 degrees and the onions didn't really tolerate that well at all. But I had some that made it, and I consolidated several beds of onions into one and this little piece of this one. Alright, so we got our furrows set up in this bed, and as you saw, I worked all of the soil, not just the rows. And if you're a no-till person, I guess this method is probably not what you would want to be using. But for potatoes, because they do like loose soil so they can develop the tubers really large in, I try to break up the entire bed just to give that aeration to the soil. And I'm always amazed at how much you can grow out of a little box, a little raised bed box like this. You know, it's 3 foot by 5 foot, and we'll get a huge crop of potatoes out of this, mainly just because of the fertility of our soil. This stuff is nice, black, fluffy, it's full of fertility. And again, we go back to how we treat our soil every season. So at least once a year, putting down that potash, if you're in an environment where you can do that. Putting some rabbit manure on this if you have access to that, chicken manure. Again, these beds were started just with composted cow manure, and over the last couple of years it has just broken down into this rich, beautiful soil that's very fertile and will grow a huge amount of food in just one little box like this. So let's do the same that we did in our last bed. We'll get set up, and we've still got more Kennebecs to get into this bed. So I just wanted to point out in this one bed that I'm getting tilled up, this here is hairy vetch. I planted this as a ground cover in some of my other beds over the winter time, and apparently a few seeds dropped elsewhere. I'm going to leave this plant in place. This is a nitrogen fixing plant. It's got a really small top root base. The roots spread down deep. So we're just going to leave this plant in place and kind of plant our potatoes around it. It'll continue to fix nitrogen throughout the season. It'll go to seed in the spring, and we'll have some of it try to come back in the fall. This is a nice little tool for raised beds. It's just a little electric Ryobi tiller. It's not going to do much for a really hard bed, but if you have some nice loose raised beds like what I have, this can definitely save you some time and effort in getting it tilled up pretty quickly. So after several hours, we have all of the potatoes planted that we're going to plant. We did have some of our seed potatoes left over. A gift to my dad. And we've got all of these buckets down through here, minus the one with the kale, planted with Yukon Gold potatoes. We've got several beds of Kennebec. Yukon Gold, I believe, in this one. Irish Cobbler potatoes in this little short one here. We've got Yukon Gold here, Kennebec, and Irish Cobbler potatoes in this bed. We came back and added some partially composted chicken manure to the tops of these beds. It has time to break down over the next 3 or 4 weeks while these come up. So it should be completely broken down and able to continue to feed the potato plants as they come up. We went and put this on all of the beds throughout the garden, not just the ones that are growing potatoes. And that's it for getting the potatoes in the ground. We'll keep you updated throughout the season on midway fertilizing, healing, and finally harvesting.